Nick Cannon, he was dropped by Viacom CBS after, a long-standing relationship that they've had. And it was after he made anti-Semitic comments on his podcast. At this point, many of you have heard the story. You generally know what this is about. Nick had former Public Enemy member Professor Griff on the episode. They talked a lot about the Jewish community. They talked about a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, speaking on them as fact. Nick eventually apologized, but I don't so much want to just focus on what happened as much as also talking about the response to what happened and the conversation that happened online after what happened. A lot of people with large followings, people with big public personas, people with big jobs, celebrities, were openly sticking up for Nick. This was before the apology. So after Viacom dropped him, a lot of people were upset by that, which was fascinating for me to see. I didn't expect that. And Nick, even like I said before the apology, he spent a day at least like retweeting comments from supporters, people who were saying you did nothing wrong. And Rebecca, I want to start with you because as you're Black and Jewish, and you talk about that, and I think your perspective is incredibly important and also seemed to be ignored, specifically in conversations like this. What were your thoughts? Feel free to break down, what was said. Because a lot of the excuses, I think, was there was education happening, but we can have education without hate and being hateful. Right?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for asking me. And I think it is really true that Black Jewish people are left out of these conversations. And I'm just really grateful to be part of it today. I think the first thing that kind of struck me that was the most sort of upsetting about the Nick Cannon incident was that, not that any of this is new. Basically, everything Nick Cannon said is, he was sort of reflecting what Professor Griff had said, which were sort of NOI, Nation of Islam, talking points about Jewish people that, Minister Farrakhan has been promoting for a very long time. That wasn't surprising to me. It's not new. What upset me was that this was sort of presented in his podcast, which he calls Cannon's Class, as a form of education. And pretty much everything that they said just reflected ignorance and arrogance, I think, towards Jewish people and Jewish identity. And so the very first thing that Professor Griff said that Nick Cannon ended up sort of like repeating later, which he got in trouble for, was that Black people can't be anti-Semitic because we are the real Semites. For me, this is, again, like this is something Farrakhan has been saying for a long time, and it reflects something that's actually harmful towards Black people to also internalize, which is, first of all, the term anti-Semitism was not invented by Jewish people. It was invented by European race scientists who were trying to make their hatred of Jewish people sound scientific. The term Semitic refers to a language group. It's not actually meant to refer to people. And when it is used to refer to people, it's in a sort of eugenics, racial characterization kind of way that isn't accurate. So when Professor Griff and later Nick Cannon said, we're not anti-Semites, we're the real Semites, you're already internalizing European white supremacy and specifically European Christian hegemony, which is part of that. And that was really concerning to me because what the Nation of Islam and people like Farrakhan are responding to a lot of the time, which is a valid problem, is that Black people, we were robbed of our history, right? And in trying to rebuild a new Black identity, a new understanding of Black history, we can't fall back on the same sort of systems that robbed us of our identity in the first place. And there's a lot of references to Jewish people that are really couched and sort of based in like Christianity. And I think this is a really frustrating thing for a lot of Jewish people, because when we use terms like Hebrews, when we use, when we identify as, with ancient Israelite people, that's not, we're not referencing Christianity at all, or Christian sort of understandings of what those terms mean, even if it's the same terms. Jewish people are referencing our own traditions, our Torah, which we read in Hebrew, which may be a similar book to the Old Testament, but really it's in a different language. So we're already kind of working from a different place. And I think what really struck me about the Nick Cannon conversation is it's just the same place of thinking that you know about other people when you really don't. And I think this isn't the only anti-Semitic issue that's happened in the Black community recently. You had Deshaun Jackson sharing this sort of weird fake Hitler quote on Instagram. And one of the responses to that from within the Black community that I thought was excellent was Jamel Hill had this point, which is like, just because we've experienced racism doesn't mean we can't be culturally arrogant. And I think that's really what this boils down to, is both a search for Black people to identify ourselves, to understand our own history better, which I support, and then doing that in a way that is both, arrogant towards Jewish people and other groups, and also based in a sort of like trying to reclaim elements of white supremacy that are not actually going to help us in the long run.
Lavanya, feel free to jump in, because I feel like we've had conversations, and not even just specific to this, but I feel like you teach me a lot. And something also that, Rebecca, that you just touched on, it's like Oppression Olympics. And why is it so hard for us to get that bashing one marginalized community doesn't uplift in any way? That I think that seems to be what people think, like there's a race to equality and it means jumping over other groups. And also there was something that people who, mean well, saying things like, the Jewish community and the African-American community, they're not mutually exclusive. And we have to stop doing that.
Yeah, I think another point, and I want to be careful here and recognize that I'm speaking as an outsider, and so I welcome to be corrected at any point in time, because I'm always on a journey to be a better person, so I don't presume to situate myself as perfect or anything close to it. But so I welcome that, if you're okay with that. But in regards to the Oppression Olympics, there tends to be within the Black community in our quest for equity or deconstructing systemic powers of racism and everything else, this idea that we can only do that if we move into the role of the oppressor. And so then, as you said, Rebecca, is that at times that presents, and probably more times than we'd like to admit, but at times that presents as us taking on or internalizing ideologies that are actually wholly incongruent with our histories, our beliefs, and it comes from this Eurocentric perspective of what it means to not be oppressed, which is to be the oppressor. And so I think there has to be a transition and a shift to recognizing that our oppression is all rooted in the colonialization and genocide of the U.S. And it all stems from there, right? That Eurocentric white supremacy, patriarchy. And we have to begin to deconstruct those things outside of us, but also within us, as we move towards our quest for equity, freedom, liberation, or whatever you want to call it.
I feel like there's so much more left to this conversation. So, Rebecca, I want to, completely give you the floor. This is educating, even.
Well, can Rebecca, can you explain something to me? What exactly do you mean by cultural arrogance? I've never heard that before.
Yeah, so this was something that I was sort of like riffing on from Jamel Hill's piece in The Atlantic, where she talks about this. And I think it's just thinking you know better and you can tell other people what their culture is when you haven't done the work at all to engage it. And I think for me being, Black in the Jewish community and Jewish in the Black community, I experience this from sort of both sides all the time, where people want to talk about each other, but they don't know the other person to talk about them, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a tendency, like this sort of claim of like, we're the real Hebrews. What makes you think that when Jewish people say Hebrew, they mean the same thing that you mean when you say it, right? We're coming from like a different context, right? And so to sort of speak on other people like their contents, I think it is an arrogant thing to do. And we all can do better and learn more. And some of this isn't necessarily just Black people's fault. Like if you've been, if your religious education is rooted in, not just like the Black church, which is a really important and like liberating thing in a lot of contexts, but also like, where did we learn Christianity from? We learned Christianity during slavery. I've had the sort of privilege to benefit from both Jewish and Christian religious education. I sort of see how people talk about themselves, talk about each other. And I really don't think we're talking about the same thing a lot of times when we use some of these terms, right? So the sort of idea of like, there's an idea in early Christian theology of like supersessionism, that Jewish people had a covenant with God. And when they didn't become Christian, they broke that covenant, they failed. And now that covenant belongs to Christians, right? From a Jewish perspective, this is a pretty problematic idea, right? And when we take this idea and we filter it through European colonialism, anti-Black racism, and then Black people trying to find their own way in a country where everything they had, everything about who we were, was stolen from us, you can end up pretty confused and have some twisted ideas about what these things mean. And it doesn't mean that Black people don't have a legitimate relationship to some of these like liberatory ideas that they got from Christianity. But it does mean we have to unpack how we got those ideas, what they told us about ourselves that wasn't true, and what they told us about other people that wasn't true.
I think unpacking the ideas and I want to say kind of fact from fiction, and like some things just need to be said in plain English. Like, I don't think a lot of the Black community realizes that there are Black Jewish people. Yeah. Even though wasn't James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr. both Jewish? I know Sammy Davis Jr. was. I know
Sammy Davis Jr. James Brown. It's not clear like to what extent he was engaging, but he was engaging in Judaism and Jewish culture. And I want to be careful about talking because I don't want to like claim him without his permission, right? But there is a really deep and special relationship between Black folks and Jewish folks. And there are a lot of different ways to be Black and Jewish. You have Ethiopian Jews who practice a form of Judaism that's older than the Judaism I practice, which is based in like my European Jewish ancestry, right? You have Jewish people, all over the continent of Africa. You have Jewish people who were in the United States practicing Judaism for generations. And you can find a whole ton of different traditions. We do know that there are accounts of people who were Jewish and brought to the United States enslaved. There were also accounts of, I think there's like one case, I forget the man's name, but there was a case of a Moroccan man who was brought as an enslaved person who was Jewish. There's also cases of, European, Sephardic, or Ashkenazi Jews who owned slaves, and that can be the source of the relationship sometimes. So we have like a very complicated but rich history. And I think the fact that for Black folks, the Old Testament was a source of liberation. And a lot of the symbolism of like the Passover story, for example, which is really important in Judaism, the story of the Hebrews moving from slavery to freedom, is also important to Black people. We are in relationship and we are in conversation. We just have to understand the limits of that conversation or how it's been carried out so far. And I think bringing Black Jews into the conversation more is a really important sort of tactic we can use to like understand the places where we intersect and the places where we differ a little better.
That makes sense.
It does. I follow you on Twitter, Rebecca, and that's how I knew that you would be like, great for this conversation. But I've learned so much just from like watching your tweets, like somebody who grew up in this, super like Southern, like Baptist family, and then not knowing at all about any other religions, right? And then learning what is widely taught about other religions. And then even like your tweets have been breaking that down. And I find it fascinating, not even fascinating, but it's wrong, but your perspective seems left out of a lot of different angles of this conversation, not even just specifically. And I noticed that just from your tweets and like different things that you respond to in different conversations that you're having about Judaism, about, the Black community, about everything. And I wonder why, why like people who are Black and Jewish, that just seems, of course, like I want to hear from somebody who's Black and Jewish before I say this.
So we're having this sort of debate in the Jewish community right now about why Black Jewish voices are left out. And I think there's different reasons and like situations in both the Black and Jewish community for why this happens. In the Black community, I think we're coming from a place where the Black church is really important, and people sort of assume that as like the default position, that's your cultural context if you're a Black person. For me growing up, I had, I'm Jewish, my mom's Christian, my grandma's a different kind of Christian, my auntie's was Muslim, part of the Nation of Islam at one point. I grew up around a lot of different traditions. And so for me, it's very normal that there's a plurality, that there's always going to be more than one perspective. And there's always something else that you need to hear or consider before you kind of like make up your mind. And so like, I think there's very specific reasons why Black Jewish folks, and we are a very small part of the Black community, right, are not always heard. Within the Jewish community, we know now that Jews of color are between like 10, 12 to maybe 15% of the Jewish community. And that's actually we're a bigger portion of the Jewish community. And this is not just Black folks, but just people who are POC and Jewish at the same time. We're a bigger portion of the Jewish community than the Jewish community makes up of the American community, right? But our voices are just now being heard. And I think one issue is that we can kind of complicate people's easy narratives. In the Jewish community in the US is mostly Ashkenazi Jews. These are folks from Eastern Europe originally. That's not the only type of Jewish person there is. In other countries, you'll find that the majority of Jewish people might be from the Middle East, or might be from, maybe even like parts of Africa and different places. So there's sort of in the same way the Black community has sort of a Christian hegemony, the US Jewish community has sort of like a European hegemony that we're dealing with. And I think between those two things, the voice that is neither European in the Jewish community, or maybe European and something else in the Jewish community, or the voice that isn't necessarily Christian in the Black community, can kind of get pushed down. And I think there's a lot of interesting, and we're not the only group in either of these communities that's dealing with this, right? But we're in an interesting racial justice moment where people care about what are our relationships to each other, or are at least pressured to act like they do, right? So it's a moment where I think voices like mine, and I'm not the only one, and there's a lot of people who are both Black and Jewish who might have a totally different perspective than me, but like where our voices can kind of be uplifted, and I think we can do stuff to both make our personal situation better being in these communities, and also help our communities address some of the really complex issues that we're facing in this moment.
I think a lot of Black people don't actually realize that there are Black Jewish people. And I think that, especially if you take somebody like Professor Griff and Nick Cannon, and them having a Nation of Islam type of background, anybody with a background in the Nation of Islam, including myself, because I was raised as a Christian, or in a Christian household and Muslim household. My dad was in the Nation of Islam. I almost know for sure, if you can break down and unpack some of the things that you're saying that are rooted in European Christian rhetoric, a lot of it would disappear. Because, I mean, you saying that, for me, I'm like, are you serious? I'm repeating the same stuff that these European Christians are, who, I know what they did to me, and I know all the lies that they told to me. And so it only makes sense. And they lie about us all the time. And they project us in a way all the time. So to me, it makes sense that they would do it to somebody else, even, if they happen to look like them. They're not Christian at the end of the day. And we all know it happened to Jewish people not everybody knows the history of Jewish people in Europe, and how they were basically, all throughout the history of Europe, they've had a hard time, right? Yeah. And so I think if more Black people were educated towards that, and they knew that they were basically repeating racist, then a lot of it could stop. But I guess this is one of those teachable moments. But I know a lot of Black people, how they're saying they believe this is fact. But I could see where those facts come from. We think all the things that come from that area are facts, like the way that we grew up. And a lot of us, even though we're not Muslim, I think Brooke brought this point up at one point. In the Nation of Islam, they call Minister Farrakhan minister instead of the traditional, I can't remember.
Like imam.
Like imam?
Yes, imam. Yes, instead of Imam Farrakhan, they call him Minister Farrakhan. And the minister is a Christian term. And so even in the Nation of Islam, we still have that Christianity background. And
a lot of the stuff he says sounds like a Baptist teacher.
Right. And so I think if more of that was brought to light, then it would be easier to unpack a lot of the things that we're talking about now.
I think you're right. And I think a big part of this is that if you look at the history of the nation, which goes back to like the early 20th century, Christian influence is part of it. The Christian Bible is part of the Nation of Islam theology. I don't think that means the Nation of Islam is a necessarily bad thing. I'm not here to say Christianity is a bad thing either. But you do have to understand that the time that these organizations like the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, some of the Black Hebrew Israelite traditions were being made, people were trying to move away from like white Christian supremacy, but they were also very attached to certain things that we got through that. And it doesn't mean you can't still have a relationship to, for example, the King James Bible or whatever. But you have to kind of unpack, like, if we're going to say we're Afrocentric and we're rejecting white supremacy and the things that white supremacy taught us, what are we bringing with us, and what is the foundation of our new tradition? And I think the sort of synergy between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism that you see as a sort of a natural progression of Abrahamic people like living together in places like the United States, and Black folks being influenced by all these things in a lot of different ways, that can be a really powerful cultural tool for us. But we have to engage it critically, and we have to look at, like, when we talk about Jewish people as bankers, greedy, controlling the media, what is that, like, where is that coming from?
Right. I don't think we realize where it's coming from.
And if you look historically, what has been the use of these ideas? Why have they persisted? It's because they help sort of camouflage the real system of power. And we can have a conversation about how Jewish people in the United States, for the most part, have assimilated into whiteness and are part of that power structure. But if you're blaming Jewish people for that power structure, like the Nation of Islam does with its book, The Secret Relationship Between the Blacks and the Jews, where Jewish people are portrayed as orchestrating slavery, right? You're letting a lot of people off the hook who were involved in that. And Jewish people were involved in these things, but they were not the ones driving it, you know?
Right. I get it.
So we have to understand our history. And so it's frustrating to me when Nick Cannon is like, I'm going to tell you all the real history. And what he's repeating is actually a sort of mythology that protects white Christian supremacy in this country. I swear to you,
I think if more people realize that was happening, they'd have a problem, especially Nick Cannon himself.
Totally.
That's the only way it works, though, is that you trick all of these other people to help you protect yourself.
Right.
And then now we've just gotten to the point where different people of different backgrounds don't even realize that they're doing it.
Yes. Yeah. It's a pillar of divide and conquer for sure.
And the Jewish community, we have our own battle with this. And, you know, when I'm in Jewish spaces, I'll be having the almost opposite conversation of this, is like, how are we also internalizing messages about Black folks and other minorities that make us feel safe because we can feel like white people, but really it's just buying into a system that harms us as well, you know?
Yeah.
So and I think a lot of Black folks, just one thing I want to say is, like, they have a sort of righteous indignation when they're asked to be responsible for people like Farrakhan, because that can come across as like very like infantilizing almost, and like making people responsible for sort of like the worst voice in their community, or boiling down Farrakhan, who's a very complex figure, into like one or two statements that are very incendiary, right? So I think that people do have a natural reaction against what they perceive as like white people telling them what to do and who they can interact with. But at the same time, we have to understand what it is that we're perpetuating when we engage in some of this stuff.